I mean, in a lot of political and even religious discourse today, we caricature the other side, or we think we know what they mean, but we actually don't take the time to understand the argument. And what I'm trying to suggest is when you can state the argument in a way that is recognizable to the other side, that actually sets up much better disagreement.
If you're discouraged by our divided, angry culture, it's really difficult sometimes, especially with social media. Everybody is disagreeing about everything. And if that's annoying you, you're not alone, but it doesn't have to be this way. Today's guest is John Inazu. He's going to reveal a surprising path to learn how to disagree in ways that build new bridges with our neighbors and coworkers and loved ones, help us find a better way to live joyfully in a complex society. John is a law professor, former trial lawyer. He's written 3 books. This one is Learning to Disagree, the Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. And you said you mentioned the TV show The Office, and it spurred your idea to share his story as a way to opening your book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was reading the insider's guide to the sitcom The Office, and one of the really surprising pieces of information in that book is a lot of the stories were true stories. The writers and the producers had actually experienced them in life. They'd fallen into a koi pond during a job interview and just crazy stuff like that. And so it occurred to me as I was reading that book, my life is not quite as funny, but I do have these experiences inside and outside the classroom that work really well as stories. And so that was the idea, that if I can put these stories together in a compelling narrative that also provides some ideas and insights on disagreement and how we do that better, then that might be a book worth writing.
Yeah. Well, you also talk about faith is part of what you do there. Talk about that. How's your faith become intertwined with your career?
Yeah, so I teach at a very non-Christian, non-religious school where there's not a sense of Christianity around campus, but I've always been fine being public as a Christian, and I've written for Christianity Today and other Christian publications, wrote a book with Tim Keller, and I found when we start with a posture of not controlling the place, that I just am happy to be here. And my school will never be a Christian university, but there's a place for Christians to be here. And we are good at what we do, and we love our campus, and we love being part of the Christian community as well. And so that's been a huge part of my professional role since I've been teaching.
Now, you used to be a trial lawyer at one point. That's the ultimate in arguing, right? Tell us, how does the law help us learn about disagreement?
Yeah, so this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because when a lot of people think about lawyers, they think about people who argue badly, right? And some lawyers certainly fulfill that stereotype. But I would say the best kind of lawyering is the kind of lawyer who actually deeply understands the other side of an argument and who can state it in the best possible way with charity and empathy, sometimes only to be able to knock it down or to be able to strengthen your own side. But that kind of skill that makes good lawyering and makes our legal system work actually then also can play out in very ordinary conversations around the dinner table or in the neighborhood. And so the goal here is to use the good kind of lawyering as a model for other people in their daily lives.
To try to get where they're coming from helps you tell your side. Is that where you're coming from?
Get where they're coming from, but in the best possible light, so that you can actually state their position in a way they would understand and recognize. I mean, in a lot of political and even religious discourse today, we caricature the other side, or we think we know what they mean, but we actually don't take the time to understand the argument. And what I'm trying to suggest is when you can state the argument in a way that is recognizable to the other side, that actually sets up much better disagreement.
So what is holding us back from a healthy disagreement? I mean, there's a lot of disagreements, but it's not been healthy.
How much time do you have? I think the kinds of habits and practices that many of us have fallen into. Think about how a lot of us engage on social media, which doesn't encourage nuance or depth or charity. When we spend a lot of our time engaging in those ways, it shouldn't surprise us that we lose the skills of good conversation and good disagreement. So that's part of it. And I think another really important aspect is, as more and more people, and this includes people who go to church but aren't necessarily plugged into their faith, but also people outside of church, as politics becomes the ultimate for a lot of people, then the stakes get a lot higher and the arguments get a lot nastier. And so in some ways, part of the needed remedy is to put politics back in its place. It's important, but it shouldn't be our primary identity.
You referenced this earlier. You were talking about empathy and patience and forgiveness, which, learning to disagree puts a pretty big emphasis on that as far as dealing with those that we don't agree with or who don't agree with us. I'm going to tell you right now, empathy, patience, and forgiveness, none of those are my forte. So for people maybe coming from my perspective, we really have trouble inserting that into disagreement. Can you share a story from the book that maybe gives us a better look at how that would play out?
Well, yeah. So you're not alone. A lot of people really do struggle with this. And I think one thing we need to do culturally is just to tell more and better stories. So one of the stories that I talk about in the book is from my own family history when it comes to forgiveness. My grandparents, as Japanese Americans, were imprisoned during World War II, and they lost everything. They had these prospering careers, and everything was taken away from them. And after the war, they came back to a life of utter poverty. And decades later, the U.S. government issued a formal apology and a small amount of payment to all Japanese Americans who had been interned. And as I discuss in the book, as I tell that story, to me, one of the most powerful examples out of that was my own grandmother, who was, the money was fine, but it wasn't much money. I think she bought kitchen cabinets with it, all these years later. But it was the apology from the government that meant so much to her. And in response to that apology, she was able to forgive this massive injustice that would never be fully remedied in this world. But that posture of forgiveness that she demonstrated was, to me, so powerful. And it's one of the stories that I try to tell here, that in some ways, as hard as forgiveness is, and it's really hard, if we're able to do it in big and small ways, it's one of the best ways forward at living in a community.
Speaking charitably, speaking truthfully, those can be pretty difficult to reconcile with one another. I don't see a lot of those two happening at the same time. So how on earth do we learn to balance those two things?
Well, we have it right in the core of our faith, the idea of speaking truth in love. And I think if we are around people who consistently lose one of those, we should be on guard and we should be looking quickly for other voices in our lives. So we do need to speak clearly about the truth that we proclaim and the confidence that we have. But there's a way to do that with a compassion that looks at the person before us. And I think, we start with everyone around us being image bearers and other human beings. And when we can do that, we're not talking about abstract categories of people. We're talking about actual human beings, even when they disagree with us, even when we think they're doing the wrong thing. And without that, this is, the scriptural passages about the noisy gong when love isn't present. We have to be speaking clearly, but also lovingly to the people around us. And I think, quite frankly, there are a lot of examples today of Christians not doing that well. And so to have counterexamples becomes really important.
I wonder if part of that is, the Bible talks about casting your pearls before swine. In other words, are they able to handle what I'm even going to say? Maybe you have to kind of listen to the Holy Spirit on the front end and go, is this worth a conversation or not? Does that enter in as well?
Yeah, so that's definitely part of it, right? We have to have prudence of not only when to speak, but when not to speak. But I also think about, I mean, years ago, I used to be a volunteer with the ministry Young Life, and one of Young Life's mantras is earn the right to be heard, right? In other words, don't start spouting what you believe unless you actually have some credibility with your audience. And I think that today, especially, people we're talking to in any context, they want to know, do you care about them as human beings? Are you interested in their questions, or do you just have something that you want to, convey to them? And I think that the best form of relationship and the best form of engaging with other people is a mutuality that says, yeah, I actually want to hear what you have to say too. I'm ready to take your questions, and I'm not just here to preach to you.
That's good. So if we, somebody's listening and maybe they felt like they have had a trouble with just clear and authentic dialogue. Sometimes you're like, where on earth do I start? Like, what's one or two just practical tips if it's like, okay, I'm going to start communicating better today that we can launch into? Because I'm guessing all of us are going to encounter at least one situation today where there's going to be a disagreement. I mean, it's hard to find a day where that's not present.
Yeah. So let me give you three thoughts here. One is be willing to have some thick skin. Be willing to hear something and not react just spontaneously to it. But, even if it kind of sounds off, just ask a follow-up question instead of taking offense. Second thing is, if you have time, it always works better to build in multiple conversations and space them apart. So if you really want to go deep on something hard, have a conversation and then have a commitment with the other person to come back in a week and keep talking about it, preferably with food involved, and some hospitality.
Queso softens everything.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And then just that space in between opens up possibilities to ask better questions and to reflect on what's been said. And then the third piece of advice here is, if you're really wanting to practice this, especially for the first time, don't start with your family. Because family can just be the hardest for all kinds of reasons. So start with a friend and work up to family after you have a better handle on how you're going to engage.
That's smart. That
Yes.
makes a lot of sense. We kind of touched on it a little bit. It's important to know when to engage with a hard conversation and disagree and walk away. When do you know, or when should you go ahead and it's better to have that conversation anyway?
Well, certainly when you're in a trusted friendship and you see a friend who is going awry or is, moving toward a belief that's going to be harmful to them, then I think we've got a responsibility in friendship to speak. I think there are times when some of us are called to speak more broadly and culturally, but I actually find that in today's environment, more of us seem to self-appoint ourselves as public spokespeople than is probably needed. And I think especially on social media, right? So think about how many times, you or I have felt the urge to say something on social media back. And I just think it's seldom the case a few days later. I think, well, I'm really glad I said that because God really needed me to weigh in on Twitter, right? Probably not in most cases.
That's true. You're right. A lot of it's. I think you're emboldened online to say things you wouldn't in person.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and you think that there's kind of this weird outsized importance that comes from the dopamine hits and all the likes. You get 15 likes on social media and you think the world agrees with you, but really, that's a pretty small sample size, right? Probably your friends anyway.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. So many people get caught up in the concept of fairness with their own definition of what's fair. Now, this is what I think is fair. So, why are you laughing already?
Because you say that's me.
Yeah, kind of. So, what can studying law teach us about fairness?
Yeah, this is one of those examples or issues where my experience in teaching and studying law, I think, becomes really helpful. That everyday conversations, and it's the realization or the insight that it's very hard to be fair across the board, that it's the law in our relating with one another is seldom as black and white as we think. So there are certainly issues of fairness, right? With my 3 kids, if there are 3 cookies and there's one left, then the kid who hasn't had a cookie should probably get it. That's pretty easy and straightforward. But when it comes to how do you punish someone for a crime, or how do you hold someone responsible for a harm they've committed, that becomes extremely complex when you start to ask questions about the background of the person or the circumstances that happened, or how you punish 2 people in similar situations at different times. And the law really struggles with this idea of fairness, and it reminds us that these are human actors and human systems that sometimes are doing their best but won't always get it right. And I think when we can engage with our neighbors and even our adversaries, recognizing that fairness is much harder than we think, that's a good starting point to a discussion.
In a way, that's kind of encouraging, and not that Congress got it right when they enacted the law, but I know that we try to put those in place to be fair. If the law is having a hard time being fair, maybe we're not going to be fair all the time with each other. It's just the way the world is. So that makes a lot of sense.
We've addressed empathy several times already. Obviously, that's kind of a key component. And in an ideal world, that's a two-way street, but we know that is not always going to be the case. And so how do we disagree well in situations where the other party is not willing to try to be empathetic, or, heaven forbid it's us in that situation?
Right. Well, this goes, one of the things we said a little earlier is we do have to have a little bit of wisdom about when not to engage. I mean, we are not called to engage in every battle or every conversation or every disagreement. So sometimes for our own sake or for the sake of others, it's best just not to engage. But there are other times, I think, when we encounter someone who is not being empathetic or who's not treating us kindly, where I think, especially as Christians, we've got some pretty deep resources that say, don't just love the people who are kind to you, but love your enemies, right? And showing the fruits of the Spirit is not contingent on how other people act toward us. So I think we've got some resources and some motivations in our scriptural tradition that say sometimes you have to take the hits and continue to engage with a different mode of compassion and kindness.
That's hard.
It is.
So do you ever see a situation where maybe there should be some limits to empathy?
Sure. I mean, and the reality is everybody has limits to empathy, right? To think about any political society is going to draw lines. We're not going to allow in this country the society of terrorists or the cult of human sacrifice. So we draw our empathy lines all the time, and within churches and institutions, we draw our lines. But I would say when you're clear about what your purpose is and when you've drawn those lines, then it's incumbent on the leaders and members of any organization to be generously empathetic to those in their mix. And when the lines of the organization are clear, when you're clear about what you're about, then it's sometimes easier to show empathy within.
That's good. And we were talking about practical ways to just go about this earlier, which I'm really thankful for. I remember thinking as a kid that disagreements, especially immature disagreements, didn't happen once you were an adult. Oh, there's not going to be any silent treatment. Oh, there's not going to be any angry words. I bet adults I grow up and I'm like, wow, we're actually worse than kids.
Oh, that's
in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Man, you just talk about getting stuck in this cycle of he said, she said, I'm right, you're wrong. It's hard. It's hard to navigate.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier. When we spend our lives many hours, many days in a row doing certain things, social media habits, right? Or just not taking time to be with the people around us, that's forming us in some very concrete ways. And then it should be no surprise that our ordinary or close interactions start to reflect those habits that we've created. So this is not, the fix here is not an easy solution. It means really changing some of the ways that we engage online and elsewhere, so that when it comes to these hardest disagreements, especially the people we care about, that we can do those better.
Ooh, I don't guess I ever thought about that really impacting how I communicate in day-to-day life.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Wow, yeah. Mind blown sort of moment. Wow, all right.
Yeah, when opinions collide, how do we know when to keep looking for compromise and when to maybe just let it go?
Can you ask me that again?
Well, let's say we've got a differing opinion. How do you know when to compromise and keep trying to compromise, and then when do you give it up?
Right. So I think, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. It's going to depend completely on the context. There are some situations that are not amenable to compromise. Right?
It's a deal breaker. This is the way it is.
Ice cream left.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't split it. But when you can discern that there is a middle ground, that's usually worth pursuing. And I think this happens frequently, or at least should happen, in politics. Politics is about compromise. When we have policies or laws in this country that is very diverse and disagrees about a lot of things, we should expect that we're not always going to get exactly our way. And we should expect that the laws or the tax rates or whatever it is are going to be somewhere between our preferences and the preferences of others. So sometimes that kind of compromise is what we should be looking for. And then there are other times, we might be part of a church with a particular doctrine that says, this is what you have to agree to be part of this church or its leadership. And then in those situations, the answer isn't compromise. The answer is be clear about who you are and then live into that. So there's no kind of overarching guidance except pay attention to the context and ask first whether this is a situation that is even amenable to compromise.
So let's say it is one of those situations where you just kind of have to agree to disagree. And then if so, how do we move past the fundamental differences? Or is there still a wedge between us all?
Right. There is going to be a wedge. I think, for example, I've got a good friend who's a Muslim, and we are, we know each other well, and we are in each other's lives. And there is still an important difference about what we believe. And that will be a limit in some ways to our friendship, but that's okay because we can still treat each other well. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, especially with Christians, is once you reach an impasse or a divide, when you say, you can't be part of our church because you no longer believe what we believe. It's important to be able to make those distinctions and those decisions, but once that difference has been recognized, then can we, on both sides, treat each other with a kind of kindness that will model graciousness to the rest of the world? It doesn't mean these issues aren't important, but it does mean that there's a larger world watching how we treat each other. And when we lack any kind of compassion or grace for the people who, last week were part of our church, that's not a good thing.
John, I think you're onto something, because what if the world just looks at us as followers of Christ, being completely, I guess you could say, we just disagree with everyone. We disagree with you. I guess example of your friend, they don't believe the same things that you do. They believe in a different God, and we just can't get along with those people. I think that speaks volumes too. So I think it's good to show them that we can can hang out with others that don't believe the exact same thing, because they'll know that we're Christians by our love, not by your arguing.
Right. Well, in the old, the old kind of Baptist Roger Williams, famously in the colonies, who wrote so much about religious freedom and tolerance of others, also was pretty intolerant himself of his own community, and he just kept whittling away at his church to the point of when he was on his deathbed, he said the only two people he thought were actually Christians or members of his church were him and his wife, and he wasn't always sure about her. So,
wow.
At some point, we can be a little too quick to draw our lines of purity and boundaries.
Yeah. It seems just listening, I'm thinking, man, if we could all learn to develop that skill of practicing empathy, wow, could we change the world?
Yeah, no kidding.
I mean, really, in all of our interactions just in every facet of life.
Well, I think, it's very hard to figure out how to do this in our complex, diverse society where people have different viewpoints. But I would think as a minimal starting point for Christians who say that we believe in love, joy, peace, patience, right? If we could at least embody these virtues and these practices among ourselves, that'd be a great place to start.
No kidding.
Let's start with the Bible.
Yeah.
Crazy.
If we look at the life of Jesus, who obviously did confront, but, did it in such a way that still gained disciples. There's something attractive about the guy, even though he did challenge the status quo. I think we learn a lot from that.
Well, and this is, I think, for Christians today to have utter confidence in the person and work of Jesus should give us an encouragement and a courage to act in the world, because we recognize that we're part of a much bigger story that doesn't depend on us, and we shouldn't be beholden to election cycles or national events, because we look at Scripture and we see God working over generations, and we see the faithfulness of Jesus guiding all of this. And so in some ways the pressure should be off of us, and we should have more grace and more courage because the world doesn't depend on us.
Amen.
Oh man, that's a good point. I've seen this quote several times, and it always makes me just go, wow, that's such a great reminder that you are never in any day going to encounter somebody that Jesus didn't love enough to die for. And to remember that in interaction.
That's good.
Yeah, it makes me think of a C.S. Lewis quote too, that every person we encounter is moving toward an eternal destiny in one direction or the other. So we ought to take very seriously the people we encounter and the ways in which we push them closer to eternal glory or otherwise.
That's a good quote too.
It is, yeah.
Boy, a bunch of good quotes, and you're right. Everyone's got a permanent address that they're gonna be. Let's make sure they're going to ours.
Right. Yeah.
Let's make sure I'm going to ours.
Yeah. Right.
John, this has been really good. Really appreciate it. Learning to Disagree. John Inazu. If people want to know more about you, how can they find out about you?
Yeah, thanks. I've got a website, jinazu.com, and a weekly Substack newsletter that I try to share some thoughts. It's called Some Assembly Required.
Oh, I like that.
I like that too.
That's good. Okay. Well, John, we like to end with one more question, and that is, what brings you joy?
I think first of my family and kids, but also we got a dog last year, and I'm not really a dog person, but this little guy also brings me some joy.
What kind of dog is it?
A Havanese.
Oh, no way!
Cake just got one of those.
We got one in June. And
so you know what I'm talking about then. Yeah.
Super people dogs. They want to be with you nonstop. Just adorable. Oh my gosh. And by the way, John, since I'm not home all the time, but my wife is, she's the alpha, and he wants to just be with her. It's not that he doesn't want to be with me, but it's like he definitely follows her around the house. So
cute.
He is adorable. Yeah. John, thanks for hanging with us. Appreciate it. Good stuff.
It's great to be with both of you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. All right, Learning to Disagree. It's John Inazu. Check him out. Good stuff.